It's a dream project. I joke all the time. I've been stealing from aliens my entire career. So you have to be, careful and respect the authenticity of the universe. We're not settling.
5 years later.
So it was like a 7.5 game, which I think would have been fine for an aliens game. We're not settling, but it could have been a little tighter. Like we actually tried, and it didn't work out the way we wished.
Sir, what happened in there? We shit the bed.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Only a few games like E.T. and Superman 64 have the dishonor of being considered the worst of all time. It's a lot easier to fall into the most disappointing category like Duke Nukem Forever. Ironically, Duke Nukem Forever's development sucked up so much manpower, that sounded weird out loud, that it actually contributed to the development of a game that's considered not only disappointing, but also one of the worst of all time. That of the unmitigated disaster that was 2013's Aliens Colonial Marines. Not only did the final product look far worse than the E3 demo footage did, but it had a litany of hilarious bugs in the code that vastly outnumbered those on screen. And yet, 4 years later, Gearbox president Randy Pitchford would transition from falsely advertising his way through that E3 demo and into word games about why Colonial Marines was just a victim of expectation, and that the game was only meant to be a 7.5 out of 10 game anyway, as if that was any goal to set for yourself or one of the world's most popular IPs that you supposedly loved as a longtime fan.
We're not settling.
As a casual Aliens fan, I was never really caught up in all this drama, but I'd always thought that the game looked fine, from afar anyway. And when I finally sat down with the Xbox 360 version of the game in 2020 on the Ultimate Badass difficulty, and then again on Soldier difficulty for this review, I had to do the most painful thing I'd done in a long time. Actually agree with the spirit of Randy Pitchford's self-ascribed 7 out of 10 score.
Which I think would have been fine for an aliens game.
Okay, now maybe 7's a little high, since I already determined that Mad Max wasn't really underrated as a 7, but that it accounted for the highs of that game while noting that it runs out of juice through sheer repetition. And Colonial Marines has the same trajectory, albeit with lower high points than Mad Max. There's a lot of persistent annoyances in Colonial Marines, so maybe a 6 or a 6.5 out of 10 is more accurate. But it is entirely playable, and often fairly decent. But is a resounding,
I mean, it's alright,
enough to earn a redemption arc? Or is it best left scuttled into the dark recesses of space?
Space!
Well, let's get stuck in like an Eon torch and find out.
Let's get to it. Floor is yours, sir.
If we were to go looking for the start of Colonial Marines' problems, the most obvious red flag right off the bat is how many developers are listed on the box. Gearbox and Timegate are most often credited as doing the lion's share of the work, but Demiurge Studios, Nerve Software, and Check 6 Games also contributed. So the story goes that Sega bought the rights to the Aliens franchise in 2006 and got a deal worked out with 20th Century Fox that Gearbox was to be the primary developer. While Sega denies they ever outsourced primary development of the game, an anonymous developer told Destructoid that sometime between 2007 and 2008, they actually canceled the game briefly and almost took legal action against Gearbox when they found out that they'd been taking people off of Colonial Marines and putting them on their upcoming Borderlands game, as well as the eternally in development Duke Nukem Forever, while still collecting development milestone checks meant to pay a much larger team. Not only does this contradict Sega's official statement, but developer Timegate is clearly credited in the intro cutscene, and Scuttlebutt, like this person who also claims to be an ex-Gearbox dev during this time, said that Gearbox had only been working on multiplayer after a certain point. Now, when the game had been handed off to Timegate in 2010, to their utter surprise, the 4 years of Gearbox development supposedly just amounted to a bunch of ill-matching assets jammed together, and Timegate had to finish over 80% of the campaign themselves while Gearbox was off working on the multiplayer, with Demiurge and Nerve handling the Season Pass DLC. As late as 2011, the game didn't even have a working script, and had been rewritten countless times. Sega wanted it to play like Call of Duty and pushed for more human enemies, while Gearbox and Timegate wanted it to feel more like the movies where we focused on fighting the aliens. This tug of war resulted in whole levels being scrapped unceremoniously as the mood of higher-ups dictated. In 2012, Gearbox would eventually wrest back creative control from Timegate and was totally unsatisfied with Timegate's work, as boss fights weren't there and the PS3 version couldn't run because it was over memory. So Gearbox started tweaking things right and left, even redesigning some levels from scratch, and having to accommodate last-minute requests like adding female Marines. And judging by the fact that there is one side character and one major character that's a woman, it wasn't just something they could just sort of switch the model out in the background and add a couple women and satisfy that request, meaning it was quite a big deal. The challenges in the game were added pretty hastily too, as evidenced by how they seem to go in a completely random order. This whole situation is just the stuff of corporate nightmares, and I'm just displeased that it happened to such a storied franchise, much less anyone else. Randy Pitchford would later claim that Gearbox cared deeply for the development of this game, being one of the IPs that they had wanted to do since forever, even investing their own Borderlands money into Colonial Marines development to give it a chance. Even if true, this doesn't really contradict what these ex-devs are telling us, and considering almost everything else that Pitchford claimed in his GameSpot and IGN interviews is either outright false advertising or just massive amounts of cope about how the game turned out, it's unlikely he's telling the truth here either. Plus, even if Gearbox was in charge of development the whole time, the fact that the game was falsely advertised and then didn't even work as a lower grade product on launch day is, as the man said,
right? So it's like way more embarrassing. Like, we actually tried and it didn't work out the way we wished.
The fact that the game came out at all and is even kind of decent at times is in many ways a miracle unto itself. So let's go over what the game does get right and branch out from what it could do better.
Rise and shine, Marines. This isn't a drill and you aren't in Kansas anymore.
Like any good Aliens property, our protagonist Christopher Winter and his crew of Marines awake from cryosleep, this time by their commander Cruz. It's been 17 weeks since the events of Aliens, and our Colonial Marines have received a distress call from the Sulaco ship, which appears to be overrun with creepy crawlies. Along with two other notable Marines, Bella and O'Neill, Winter and company are sent in to retrieve any survivors and put down the infestation. We'll run into a whole mess of xenomorphs and Weyland-Yutani mercenaries who are protecting the company's assets. This game was billed as the direct canonical sequel to Aliens that takes place after Aliens 3 somehow, but anyone who's played the game can tell you this is not essential viewing. It's just enjoyable enough fan fiction at best. You'll retread all the cool but comfortable set pieces you've ever seen in Aliens media with few new additions. Your companions that accompany you throughout this adventure are mostly likable and make the experience better. O'Neill and Bella are steadfast allies, and you spend so much time with them you start to feel like you're really all part of a team, and you'll appreciate their presence. Your commander Cruz is often full of bluster and bullshit, and his lines are deliciously corny.
Attention, chicks and dicks of the USS Sephora. I didn't think there was a snowball's chance in fuck any of you were coming back alive. I wake up in the morning thanking baby Jesus for every day I'm in the Corps. So I'm gonna be good goddamned if I let Weyland-Yutani take that away from me.
The voice cast delivers their fairly straightforward material well, especially Lance Henriksen, who really seems to understand the tone, whereas Michael Bain, reprising his role as Hicks, seems a bit unsure of the tone or the rhythm of the scene he's in at times.
Near Fury, the ship went into alert, and I was pulled out of cryo as the ranking and only Marine.
No! No.
That's all I got left, guys.
Unfortunately, everybody's lip syncing is rather stiff, and many characters' eyes will glow this awful red until you get close to them for some reason. Now, as for the art direction, the level design and assets are very faithful to the franchise's aesthetic. The environments have that grainy VHS in the 80s vibe, complete with signature high color contrast of computer screens and other electronics glowing against dark backgrounds. You'll also get that classic scene where you go up into a xenomorph ship and see the pilot hooked up to the gun, as well as walk the surface of the LV-426 Moon in Hadley's Hope, which is incredibly atmospheric to just sit in for a bit as you see the fires burning around you and the rain falling in hopes of putting it out. Unfortunately, while the art direction is pleasing to the eye and very faithful to the universe's look, the textures are taking way too long to load and then settling for a blurred, low-res texture. When I first wrote this review back in 2020, my mind was just thinking, hey, this is what games looked like in the 360 era, you know? It could look better, but it's not too shabby. It's just really obvious that Colonial Marines' scope was always being compromised, either to account for the crunch they put themselves under or their mishandling of their resources. A big part of this problem appears to be Sega's decision to actually make all the platforms look identical regardless of processing power, so there was a bit of an artificial cap on how good it was going to look and how well it was going to age as a result. Okay, well that's the look and the feel of Colonial Marines, so let's get down to how it plays. Gearbox and Timegate's marketing repeated over and over again the dude bro anthem of wanting you to feel like a badass when playing this game, so this means that you'll be doing a lot of shooting shit until it stops moving. Despite the wide variety of weapons and the nice looking gun models, your guns do take a long time to get used to. A fair few of the guns sound like someone's blowing raspberries. Although the plasma rifle sounds like the movies, I really enjoy the effectiveness of the pump and auto shotguns especially. And you also get to use various burst fire rifles, machine guns, and classics like the flamethrower and the smart gun. Frag grenades and fire bombs round out your arsenal, which are sadistically enjoyable to toss into a crowd and watch the bad guys writhe in flames. That said, the guns can lack weight in how they handle, kind of like Call of Duty weapons, a feeling that's exacerbated by the metric fuck-ton of muzzle drift when aiming down sights. When this built-in wobble combines with the erratic auto-aim that both pulls you too easily towards some targets and then even away from others, you wonder who pooped in Gearbox and Timegate's cornflakes the day they were testing this. The FOV is really narrow on the Xbox 360 too, which takes a while to get used to even for a console peasant like me. And no, I'm not spending $30 for an 11-year-old game on Steam to alleviate this, Randy. The hit detection and how many shots it takes to kill enemies is also really suspect. The aiming is quite stiff on the Xbox 360 controller because of all the dead zones. But even if you master this weird swaying and auto-aim problem, the chances of your shots hitting enemies consistently is all over the place. Sometimes your shots will just pass right through enemies. Other times it'll feel like the auto-aim is bending missed shots back into the direction of the enemies, although this is likely just bad hitboxes that don't match the dimensions on screen. Another weird occurrence was in the cave level, where I was shooting Xenos way up high in the ceiling. Suddenly, they just stopped taking damage, and my hit marker stopped, even though my bullets were still making contact and causing blood to spurt. Now, it's possible that because they were scripted to jump down and surprise me, that they were in an invulnerable state until I triggered them by getting closer, but it's strange they ever took damage in the first place if that was the case. This wouldn't be so egregious if it wasn't emblematic of the way that Colonial Marines likes to artificially enhance difficulty by triggering enemy spawns or only making them damageable when you've crossed a certain point in the level, usually a point where you're already kind of too deep into their territory as they swarm you and you get killed almost immediately. The guns aren't accurate or snappy enough to retaliate in these situations, and so I had to spend an inordinate amount of time sitting in doorways trying to incite enemies to come through so I could kill them one by one, as open combat was just a death wish against more than 2 enemies. All that to say, far too many combat encounters against humans are just trial and error nightmares, because at least the Xenomorphs' annoying habits are mitigated by them not having projectile attacks and being a little dumb. Combat's at its best in open areas when you're not being asked to fight the FOV, the goofy spawns, and the whack aim sensitivity. But one welcome diversion that'll actually help you account for these frustrations is the challenge system and the upgrades that you can buy off the points that you earn by completing these challenges. These challenges include feats like melee killing enemies so many times, getting so many pistol kills, or not missing with a single bullet from a rifle clip. The upgrades you can purchase include different weapon skins, more accurate sights, recoil compensators, grenade launchers or shock pellet attachments, silencers for some reason, and much more. This progression system is a really fun side hustle to keep track of throughout the game, and it promotes experimentation with your wide arsenal and all the different attachment permutations of each. One strange detail, though, is that a lot of your weapons overlap in functionality, making many of them redundant. You've got so many different types of the same weapon, especially so when you start finding legendary versions of these weapons, and they're just basically the same weapons with a special characteristic or two. It's ultimately not really a bad thing to have all these different looks and feels for these weapons, but it's the sort of frill that a poor development cycle probably didn't need to allocate resources to. This would have also benefited players a lot by reducing all the weapon switches you have to do as each gun runs dry one after the other. The AI is still a little raggedy, but it's not broken like people reported back when the game first came out. This is a little surprising to report on 360 because we didn't get that patch that came to PC. You know, the one where the modder actually managed to fix the AI by changing a misspelling in the code from TEATHER to the correct spelling of tether, TETHER. Yeah, that one. Nice attention to detail, guys. But yeah, despite these improvements, there are still some AI brain farts. The friendly AI looks like it's doing its job, but often their callouts and engaging of the enemy is purely for show, and multiple encounters are far harder than they should be because they're really not doing any extra damage. They're just sort of shooting at things to make the scene feel dramatic. It's rare, but they also lose track of the goal every now and again, and sometimes glitch out and won't open doors to let you progress into the game. Enemies will just sit in one place and not move, or comically sit behind cover with their bulbous head popping out like, "Here I am!" This behavior was also shared by the Crusher Xenos, these heavily armored bull rushing types, and the only reason I beat him on both playthroughs is because he randomly just stood still and let me pelt him with explosives until he expired. Otherwise, the enemy AI is capable enough. The average Xeno animates pretty well as long as they're crawling around the walls and ceilings, but they do look pretty goofy when they rush you with their arms completely stiff and outstretched. One of my biggest gripes, though, is that they have a way of making no noise when sneaking up on you, and they can easily blindside you for cheap deaths. To mitigate backstabs and to make Xenos come straight for me, I often had to back myself into a corner and just unload as they lined up. The melee attack that becomes available as Xenos get close is also very literally hit or miss, so that made it extra important to come up with cheesy strategies. But those are just my gripes, and most fights happen face up, and you don't get to laugh too much because you're just trying to stay alive. Beyond the basic Xenos, the Spitters are frustrating to fight as they tend to crawl around above you before descending more than the other Xenos do, and they also lob this fairly high damaging acid attack across the level at you, even if they can't see you. The boss fights are also missed opportunities. You get a power loader in one sequence and have to hand-to-hand fight a very tough Xeno, but it plays out like Rock'em Sock'em Robots where you're just sort of awkwardly spamming the attack and hoping it connects. I even had to use that strategy where I backed myself up against a wall to prevent all the little bitty Xenos from killing me before I could even engage the boss and beat him. The last boss fight is also terribly anticlimactic and replays an encounter you've seen probably 100 times in other Alien media. Between this Queen encounter and the lame one I mentioned in the Aliens Fireteam Elite video I did, I'm beginning to wonder why we can't nail this fight since we have such a good template of it in the Aliens movie already. Now, I often criticize first-person shooters for having crappy set pieces or a lack thereof. Aside from one cool stealth section where you're weaponless in the sewers and must avoid blind Xenos that explode on contact, there's not a ton of encounters with distinct scripting or gimmicks, or really any difference in tone or what they ask of you emotionally. That may be eventually what burnt me out in Colonial Marines even when I was having a decent time, because I was definitely having the same type of fun and intensity of fun throughout the whole game, with very few spikes upwards due to exciting encounters or boss fights or story revelations. When Colonial Marines finally gets past all of its awful human-enemy firefights and finds a rhythm, it still doesn't really go anywhere big, or pay off any great expectations you might have about the things you've either seen done in the movies or maybe something that you think would only work in a video game form that you always wanted the movies to do. And I guess this is as good a time as any to list any other rapid-fire faults that I found with the game that make moment-to-moment gameplay drag like this. In an early section in the hangar, you must defend a doorway that another Marine is hacking. The checkpoint's nearly impossible in Ultimate Badass because of how many Xenos rush you and how inaccurate your guns can be, but if you run to the back side of the room and just stand there, almost no Xenos attack you, and the AI finishes off the rest till the door opens. Unfortunately, I couldn't replicate this glitch on my recent playthrough to show you, so I can only give you this anecdote from 2020. There was also this checkpoint from that first playthrough where the AI is supposed to open a door, but they just didn't, requiring me to restart the checkpoint. It reloaded instead, though, the second to last checkpoint, not the one I just earned, which sucked because that area before had been really frustrating me and taking me quite a while to get through already. I had to complete it again, then got back to the door, which finally opened this time, but it was rather annoying and unnecessary. So that's Colonial Marines proper. But the last aspect of the game worth mentioning is the Stasis Interrupted story DLC. This short campaign lets you play as 3 different people, 2 of which have been captured by Weyland-Yutani, and 1 of which is a defected Weyland-Yutani scientist. Surprisingly, this got a positive rating on Steam, and generated a Steam forum post or 2 comparing it favorably to Doom 3, which is one of my favorite games. And while the public tends to hate on the main game and praise the DLC, for me, at least on my first playthrough, it was directly the opposite. Though I softened a bit to it on my second playthrough because I appreciated its slow pace and suspense a lot more. The first chapter is a bit straightforward and sparse, with you following a scripted set of triggers as people open doors for you in rooms with nothing to interact with or see. You eventually get some guns, and there's a bit of emotionality as you lose some of your pals along the way, but it's more or less a straight shot. And so is the second chapter, Controlling Stone, voiced by none other than Ezekiel from The Walking Dead, Gary Payton.
Yet I smile.
The third chapter lets you play as a defected Weyland-Yutani scientist as he helps Hicks get out the transmission that starts the main game, and this is a lot more interesting tonally, if more frustrating because the gunfights are still so loose. Still, as bland as much the gameplay is, I have to admit there's a lot better horror pacing in this episode, and something other than talking about mission parameters, shooting, and something about making the ship do so-and-so was nice to see. There are some gut-wrenching scenes of Xenos killing people, and of the exploitation that the Weyland-Yutani Corporation has subjected the people here to, but I'd have loved to have seen more of this as opposed to more of the garbage firefights. So, yeah, as a complete package, Aliens Colonial Marines can often be frustratingly loose in its gameplay, but it's in a state now where it's absolutely playable, and often some fun enough, light fan service. I don't think the vociferous hate is warranted anymore, at least for the people who just want to know if the game is going to be worth their time. I was honestly surprised I had some pretty decent fun with it. Though I'll admit I experienced a lot of small, persistent annoyances. Didn't bother me as much in my first playthrough, but grated a little bit more the second time through. I just felt like I died quite a bit to lots of cheap things that I didn't realize or recognize as much, even playing 2 difficulties higher in my first playthrough, so maybe I'm just old and slow now. Now, it's not to say that Colonial Marines is a game of intense highs, regardless of skill. It's a little mid-grade romp that never dipped into terrible and had some good moments. Honestly, the texture of it feeling like an Aliens product probably elevated it for me, not detracted from the experience, as it amplified some less exciting sections from a design standpoint through sheer atmosphere and context alone. Colonial Marines is a totally fine game, and certainly so if you're an Aliens fan. Is it groundbreaking? Absolutely not. But it is serviceable, and I can name you 100 games that are worse than it by far. So check it out if you're an Aliens fan and just want something new to go through. I think you'll have a surprisingly good time with it, certainly more than you've heard. And don't worry, if it's a little frustrating, don't be afraid to let it out, because no one can hear you scream in space.
Space!
Thanks for tuning in. And like any good station worth its bandwidth, I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. I'm talking Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Shantiva, Hey Blondie, Yak Show, M, Bibby F. Blocksberg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those subscribed to my highest tiers. The Nth Review, James Wyatt, and Hot Hamlet. If you'd like to keep on what few lights I have here, you should join these folks at patreon.com/highfunctioningmedium, or become a YouTube channel member, or donate at Ko-fi or PayPal. Also, check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support this station with no cost to you. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.